Okay, we are going to introduce how to take the square root of a negative number. For every math class that you've had so far, you've always learned you can't take the square root of a negative, and that's going to change today. So we are going to actually define, the square root of a negative 1 to be this thing called an imaginary number. We labeled it as I. So when we go to simplify, we're going to start off today just kind of doing the basics and understanding what I is, how you add I, how you simplify I. And if you have a square root like you see here on this slide, we're going to treat it the same way that we've always treated them in terms of simplifying. So we're going to go back to our kind of geometry rules of simplifying radicals and just add in what happens when you have an I. And not much changes, actually. So if I have the square root of negative 16, I'm going to understand that I could actually treat that as the square root of 16 and the square root of negative 1. And the square root of 16 is 4. And we just defined the square root of negative 1 to be this magical thing called I, which is an imaginary number. So the square root of 16 is 4, but the square root of negative 16 is 4I. So basically the negative is just going to add an I in your answer. So if I see the square root of negative 49, I don't need you guys to write this every time. If you can understand that that's going to just be treating the square root of 49 as always, which is 7, and understanding that since you have that negative, you're going to have an I, you can go right from square root of 49 down to 7I. That's fine by me. If you have the square root of something that doesn't have a perfect square, you're going to treat it as you normally have. So you're looking to see what is the perfect square that goes into 48, and that's going to be 16. It's 16 times 3 is 48, and then you have this negative 1. So you can split it actually into 3 different things. Square root of 16 is 4. I can't do anything with the square root of 3. And here, this negative 1 underneath this radical is actually going to be an I. We tend to write the I before the radical instead of after it. So typically, you would actually see that as 4I root 3. We have a couple more here. We can have fractions, and what you need to understand that when you're taking the square root of a fraction, you can actually just separate the square root into both of them. So we have the square root of negative 16. We actually did that up here. We realized that was 4I, and then the square root of 25 is 5. If you see a negative, you don't put it for both fractions, both numerator and denominator. It's only going to go on the 1. We're going to make that be I. You typically write it in the numerator, so I is in the numerator. So if I have the square root of negative 32 over 49, I'm going to treat that as the square root of negative 42 over the square root of 49. We know the square root of 9 is a nice number. That's 4. Or I mean, that's 7. And square root of 32 is the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. And then you're going to have that I because it's a negative. So you have 4I root 2. Eventually, we're going to work this into getting I's from the quadratic formula and how you simplify them. If you take a look at these next two that I have this slide, don't they look like you just did the quadratic formula? Like this would be your minus b. Negative 9 is what you got when you simplified everything under the radical. So this looks just like you had an answer from a quadratic formula, and we can simplify that. We know that the square root of negative 9 is going to have an I because of the negative, and the square root of 9 is 3. So that's actually going to be an answer to us now. I know you couldn't do it before, but we're going to actually relate it to I's at this point in time. And one more from the quadratic formula. 25 is a perfect square that goes into 75, 25 times 3. So you are going to get 5 square roots of 3, and it's negative, so I add in that I. So today you're going to just simplify I, and the other thing that you need to understand from today is just the concept of a complex number and a real number, and that we can add and subtract them like we have done in every other math class with x. So a complex number is the combination of a real number and an imaginary number. It combines both of them together as like one expression. So if I have two complex numbers and I'm adding them together, you're adding like terms like you've done with x all along in your math classes. So I would have 3 plus 2. Those are the two real numbers. I add them together. And then I add the two imaginary numbers together. Treat it like an x. If I had negative 5x and 7x, I would be able to add them. So I have negative 5i and 7i is going to add together to be 2i. So you can add complex numbers, you can subtract complex numbers. This is going to be the same as we've always done. You're going to have 9 minus negative 2 is going to become 9 plus 2, which is 11. And negative 2i, this is going to become negative 3i, so we're going to have negative 5i. So we added them and we subtracted them. Next week we're going to multiply and divide them. That is a little bit harder, but it is doable. So right now we just need to make sure we can simplify and then we can add and subtract complex numbers.